Okay, today we are going to talk about power wire. Selecting power wire for a car audio system, for accessories. This can be pretty much be used universally. Trucks, cars, ATVs, side-by-sides, motorcycles. When you're selecting power wire for car audio and accessories, I'm going to say the first thing you need to do is, and I can't emphasize this enough, is do not use copper clad wire. You'll see wire advertised as CCA. There's actually two problems, not just the copper clad. One, you want to make sure you're actually getting the American gauge of wire. That's when you see the AWG. Copper is expensive. We can't get around that. So what has happened is you've got two things. You've got one, they're not advertising the actual American gauge, which would be, let's say you want 4-gauge wire. It would be 4 AWG. And that means that the wire, and I have a piece here, I'll show you. That means that the wire you're getting is actually 4 AWG right here. Just the copper. Has nothing to do with the jacket. 4-gauge copper wire. Okay, now what they're doing today is they do two things. One, they try and sell you 4-gauge power wire, and they call it 4-gauge copper, CCA. What that means is copper clad aluminum. Basically, if you look into the end of this, you see it's silver, because it's aluminum. Now, each strand has been plated in copper, but when you cut the end to use it, it's aluminum. It's very, very light. It will conduct electricity, but it will not last, and that's the big problem. The other thing that they do on top of doing that is that sometimes they'll tell you it's 4-gauge wire, and it is copper, but it's not AWG. So this wire here, while it is copper, has a huge thick jacket around it, and they're trying to tell you that that whole outside diameter is 4-gauge. So it's got much thinner wire, but the outside diameter of the jacket is 4-gauge. So you've got to really read, and I tend to find one supplier of copper wire and try and stick with it so I know I'm getting quality wire. Most of these kits that you buy, like here's one from Rockville. Okay, it's a Rockville 4-gauge kit, very cheap, like 20 bucks. It has everything: power, ground, fuse holder, RCAs. It has everything you would need. The problem is it's not real 4-gauge wire, and it's not copper wire, it's copper clad wire. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about Rockville. I use a lot of their amplifiers, and through the years they've come a long way. Their amplifiers I would recommend now. As far as their power wire, I haven't researched it. I don't know if they sell real 4-gauge kits or not, but the kit that came with that amplifier, I mean the amplifier came with that kit, it's copper clad garbage. Now, how can you tell copper clad when you're reading an ad? Well, first of all, if it says CCA or copper clad. The second is if it doesn't mention AWG anywhere. If it says 4-gauge, but it doesn't say 4 AWG, they're usually trying to trick you. Also, price. Copper's expensive. You know, one of those Rockville kits or this wire can be super cheap. That Rockville kit's probably like 20 bucks. Okay, you couldn't even buy the power wire for 20 bucks, let alone a whole kit. So now I'm going to show you what happens when you use copper clad wire. Okay, about 2 years ago, I did a Honda side-by-side. I did a whole audio system, and the person I did it for really didn't want to spend the money on copper wire. And I told him, well, you can't really use this, especially in a side-by-side that's going to be more, you know, of a problem keeping water out than a truck or a car. I said, and even in a truck or a car, the interior might be okay, but your engine compartment at the battery is going to be subject to water. So he said, nah, just go with the aluminum. So we went with the This was an original piece from his install. This sound 4-gauge power. So the first thing was, it wasn't a true 4-gauge, but we didn't need a true 4-gauge for the small amplifier he was using. But in this kit, it came with ring terminals and everything else. Now, he came to me the other day and said, hey, nothing works. My LED light bar, my stereo. So we looked at everything, and I could see where the connector meets the wire, that there was like a white line. All I did was grab this cable and touch it, and it broke right off, and silver powder fell out. Okay, and I'll show you what I mean. The aluminum degrades and basically turns into powder. And I'll show you. Let me get a piece of paper. We'll put it down right here. And the aluminum is no longer cable or wiring. It's just powder. And it's just sitting here. And there's no conductivity left. It won't pass a ground or power. And you can see that's what happens to your wire. I don't know if you can get a good look at that, but it just turns into gray powder. So, and you can see the end of the cable swelled up as it corroded. It did have a jacket over it. That's why it's nice and new looking here. So you couldn't see the corrosion at the connector until I slid the jacket off, and then you could see, well, this one just broke away right away, but that's what happens to copper clad wire, and that's why you need to stay away from it at all costs. It's the last thing you want to use on anything. Just don't buy it. And like I said, the price is going to be the first indication. Even with your well-known brands. Like, this is an old piece of 4-gauge ground wire from an old Rockford Fosgate kit. I would still use it today. The quality's excellent. It's heavy. It even has a braided shield around the copper wire of tinned wire. I mean, this is a nice cable. I don't know if Rockford even does anything like this anymore. Rockford, through the years, has started to get a little funny with their specifications on things. So try and stay with pure copper. Now, when you pick your pure copper wire, I just purchased this from Amazon. This is 25 feet of red and 25 feet of black 4-gauge. I bought it from a company called temcoindustrial.com. They advertise on Amazon. It's oil and gas resistant. It's basically welding cable. Good to, geez, huge heat. I mean, this is what you want to use when you're running a car stereo, or you want to try and find real 4-gauge pure oxygen-free copper. That's another thing, OFC. If it says pure OFC copper for AWG, you're in. That's oxygen-free copper. That's what most of, like, this is another piece of old, this is off a battery isolation that I had done in a vehicle that we ended up changing the system. This was another piece of Rockford cable back in the day. It was very good cable. This was your power wire. Again, pure oxygen-free copper, real 4-gauge. So you need to find that if you don't want your wire to just decompose and fall apart. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I bought this 25 feet of red and 25 feet in black for, it was on Amazon Prime, I believe it was $41.95, or, which I felt was a little expensive, but copper's been going crazy. Now, here we are, those few weeks later, the gentleman, by the way, this is for another job, the gentleman that had this vehicle, that now has to redo all of his wiring, said, well, I'll go ahead and buy it. We went on to Amazon, and the same exact package is, I believe, $80 or $90. It's gone up more than double in the 2 to 3 weeks. And of course, they're going to say pandemic, prices, all of that. But even further, we went back to possibly buy it, and it was already sold out and said they don't know when or if they'll be getting any more in. So finding, at this point in time, real, pure, oxygen-free copper in the actual American gauge, the AWG gauges, is becoming harder and harder to find, and very, very expensive. So when you see 20 feet of pure oxygen free, 4 gauge, and they want $39 for it. And then you see this whole kit that has not only the 4 gauge 20 feet, but ground wire in 4 gauge, all your connectors, fuse blocks, fuses, 2 sets of RCA cables and everything else, and it's $20 or $25. You're pretty much guaranteed. And if you look at the back, okay, you'll notice that they notice it's 100% copper on the RCA cables, but they never mention 100% copper again. Okay, it'll say it has a PVC outer jacket, but it's not going to tell you. And the other thing is, look, 4 gauge. You see AWG anywhere? Nowhere. So I'm not saying Rockville doesn't make a kit that's real, but this is the one that happened to come with an amplifier. All right, so here's the other thing. When you're selecting your wire for your accessories and everything else, you can look up on Google and find one of these American Automotive wire gauge tables. And this will basically tell you how many feet you're running and how many amps you're going to be drawing, and it'll tell you what gauge wire you should be using. So if you're going to do an amplifier, and let's say that right in the instructions it tells you, oh, you got to run 4 gauge wire, you're going to be sucking 100 amps of current. Okay, you'll look over here, and if you're only going to be going 15 feet, you only have to run 6 gauge of wire. 6 gauge. But if you're going to run 25 feet, you got to run 4 gauge for that 100 amps. So this will tell you whether you're running a simple light 0 to 7 amps and you're going 3 feet, you can use 18 gauge. And as far as figuring out the amps you're going to draw, most amplifiers will give you an indication in the specs, or you can look it up. And same thing with light bars. It'll say it draws this many watts of power, and you can convert watts to amps. Again, just go on Google, and you can Google watt to amp converter, and you just enter in the watts. It'll tell you what your amps is. So I'm not going to go through the math with you when it's that simple. And it'll tell you the appropriate gauge wire for how long you're going to run. The longer you run the wire, the bigger gauge you have to go for that same current. As you can see, if we go 20 amps, and we're only going 3 feet, an 18 gauge wire will do it. But as soon as you go to 10 feet, you got to step to a 16 gauge wire. And as soon as you go 15 foot, you got to step to a 14 gauge wire. And then you need to step to a 12 gauge wire at 20 and a 10 gauge wire at 25 feet. So these charts are good in helping you determine what you need to run your LED light bars, your stereo, your amplifier, horns, anything else, a heater. Anything else, and you always want to make sure you fuse it properly so that you don't melt anything. And most of the amplifiers either come with a fuse or tell you what size fuse to use. You also want it on an amplifier, you want to fuse at the battery as well as at the amplifier, because you don't want to have anything happening. Now, when you talk about connecting the ends of the wires, this is where the next problem comes in. All connectors are not created equal. When you have cable that is, let me get this set up here. When you have cable that's not AWG, it's not going to fit into an AWG connector of the same size properly. So if you buy a real 4 gauge cable, you're going to need, and excuse me, this is an old one that I found. This is actually a very heavy duty one that came with a Rockford Fosgate kit years ago, and it's very thick, and this was a 4 gauge cable. Now, this wire on this particular aluminum one, it is a 4 gauge wire, just a hair smaller, but it's aluminum. Whereas I told you before, this one here, they say 4 gauge but not AWG, and you see it swims around in there. It's way too big a connector for that. If we go to like a, let me see what this is. Is this like a 6? Yeah, it's 6 gauge wire, but they call it 4 gauge. Okay, so your connector, if you're buying real AWG wire, then you can buy real 4 gauge AWG connectors. Like this welding cable will fit this connector perfectly, and it's a big, heavy, nice battery connector. Okay, so that would fit that perfectly. Now, what I was saying is you have different types of connectors that all do the same thing. Okay? And I'll explain to you what's going on here. This, which was that original Rockford Fosgate connector, is big, thick, heavy. The front's not completely sealed. There's a little slit, but this is a very nice connector. Okay? End connector. Now, this achieves the same purpose, but as you can see, this one, the ring has a slit in the top where they bent it up. It's cheaper, it's thinner. It'll do the same thing. It is copper, and then it's tin plated. This is also tin plated. And these fit AWG 4 gauge. Okay? This also, same size hole, meant for the same thing. It's thinner. It's built very similar to the Rockford, where it has that little slit at the top of the opening on the front, but the majority is sealed. And again, completely smooth all the way around, no slits. Okay, so this is a cheap version of the Rockford connector, and then these are what considered almost like a standard connector. These are copper and tin plated. This is copper and tin plated. This one with the slit, I'm not sure. I'm assuming it's copper and tin plated, but who knows? It came with a kit. So again, these are all for AWG. The size of the hole on this little one is the same size as this one, and it's got the same opening hole size. So you'll see people go, oh, these are impossible to crimp, or the crimper doesn't work. That's because you really need to use two different types of crimpers for these. And what you can do is, on those big, thick, fat ones, this is the most economical way. You can buy these 15, 20 bucks on Amazon. They work well with these big Rockford connectors. You stick the connector in there with the wire in it, and then you bang it with a hammer. It doesn't make a beautiful crimp, but the wire won't come out. You can also heat these up and add a little bit of flux and solder and get a really good connection on them. And that'll do that. You can do these in there, but because of that split, make sure you put the split side down when you do your crimping. If you do the split side up, you'll end up with a horrible crimp. Now, this... okay, so the ones that look like they're tin-plated cheap ones, rust, so they're not copper underneath. This was the mark from it being hit by this crimper, and I mean, it held, it never fell out until the copper just disintegrated. The other kind of crimper that you'll see being sold, this one here is sold all over Amazon. Now, if you try and use that hammer crimper with these 4 gauge connectors, you're probably not going to have too good of results. I mean, it'll be okay, but this crimper works good with this type of connector. Now, these crimpers that they're selling all over Amazon, they sell 2 versions. One is American AWG and the other one is metric. If you decide to buy one and you were working with 4 gauge wire, make sure you buy the AWG version. You see it's got number 4, 2. I think this one goes all the way down to 2 gauge. It might even go smaller. You just press on the tab and you roll them 1 gauge. So it goes from 1 to 8 gauge is what it says. Okay? So now, these will crimp pretty well in this, but what I found is if it says you're using a 4 gauge connector, and I set the crimper to 6 gauge, it seems to work a little better. You'll also see people complaining that this doesn't work, it doesn't fit the connectors, because this is meant for these little thin connectors. Okay, it is not meant for these big fat ones. You can see that the difference in the outside diameter and the thickness of this. So this crimper is not going to give you good crimp. Now you might be able to go up to 2 gauge or 1 gauge, and you might get an okay crimp, but it's meant for these little, these are standard copper battery connectors that have been tin plated. They work great, but you want to use the correct crimper, and because there's such a wide variety of ends, that's where you run into your problems. So I'm hoping that this helped you guys today in selecting your power wire. It's too bad copper prices are crazy right now. When I do the installation on the, I'm working on that Yamaha Wolverine, doing all kinds of upgrades to it. I'll go through the actual assembly of the wires, getting them cut. I'll solder a few of them to show you. But until then, I hope that you don't buy copper clad wire. Thanks for watching.